So when you start thinking about the programmatic ecosystem and the way it functions, we'll start there. The most important thing about the functionality of it right now is as we start moving away from cookies, we start moving away from daisy chained ID systems, things along those lines. What is exciting now is that we can actually move toward what I consider this heart and mind alignment. And what I mean by that is that the functionality is moving into more contextual based media, contextual based advertising. Context has always been considered kind of this old school thing of the past, but really as you start understanding that people move in waves, they move in larger cohorts, the ability to start executing against those cohorts is actually pretty exciting, especially when you can look within the programmatic ecosystem, understanding the flexibility of it, the publisher alignment strategies that you can engage with, and specifically making sure that within those spaces you can build different adjustable cohorts for brands in a very meaningful way. So it almost becomes a bespoke way of targeting to a larger group, which can increase efficiency. It can allow for brands to actually understand their audiences more at a aggregate level, but that aggregate understanding allows also for less of a chase into crazy personalization, but executing meaningful creative against larger groups of people that move the needle faster. So that's one of the most exciting things right now within the way that programmatic is being viewed. Now, kind of talking about the lens of transparency and where we're headed, it's the data partners, number one, that we work with, okay, are very important in how we start to contextualize against this context that we were talking about, right? Building what we would call artistic layers, okay? And what I call it is like this data artistry so that we can start looking at context differently within the execution layers of the publishers. The publishers have so much information. And what we've kind of done historically is we've looked at the granularity of one-to-one data, which is going to be a bit of a loss moving forward. But what is exciting about it is that as we start to, as brands partner with our publishers in a meaningful way, that partnership will allow us to understand really the reason, the rationale, the why behind the content. The content is attracting the consumers. The consumers are engaging with it. Then you say, okay, if I understand that portion of it, then what I can also understand about them is really the way that that content is triggering a certain emotion. And if I can look at that across the portfolio of that cohort, then the way that I can actually move the media toward them starts to become a lot more impactful. So brands now start to have this understanding of publisher relationships. They understand how the audiences engage with them. The transparency aspect, it's no longer, this tax thing that's happening inside of the programmatic ecosystem, but there's a clarity between the publishers, the brands, and the audience. And then once you start to triangulate those things in a meaningful way, programmatic is really doing what it was meant to do a long time ago, by taking this automation strategy that's been put in place, using the power of the actual technology, but use it in a way that starts to actually align emotion, empathy, and human behavior. So when you think about targeting audiences and addressability and all of the different crazy things that we used to be able to do, I bucket it in two different categories. There's rational data, and then there is emotional and empathetic data. One of the things that we've done within the Mindshare environment, and to answer the question that you're talking about, is we've moved more into this precisely human framework. And what that means is that in the precisely human framework, we look at empathy, okay, we look at accuracy. So when you start thinking about empathy, what actually drives the emotions and the feelings of a consumer? You start looking at accuracy, well, you've got all of these 10,000, 20,000 variables that are living, all over the place. And what does that actually mean when you start aligning it to empathy? Bridging those two things together really allows us to move into a different space of addressability, because addressability means nothing if the message is wrong. Addressability means nothing if the publisher ecosystem doesn't resonate with the audience on the other end of the line. So we want to make sure that we have alignment within those spaces by understanding the consumer in a much different way. If we only look at the data points, it's very interesting when you start thinking about, I'm going to use myself for an example. You have a black male who's 42 years old who lives X, Y, and Z and has, these kind of things. You could take another one of them and put them in the same category, and we have totally different emotional need states and reasons and why we do what we do. So us trying to reach that same person in the same way really kind of misses the bell, especially because the thing that moves me is internally. So creating codification and addressability around those different areas of opportunity, doing it within what we consider a precisely human framework, somebody else might call it something different, and then having a group like a choreograph that backs you up, and I can speak a little bit to that of what WPP has gone through the process of developing to give you that accuracy tenet, starts to bridge everything together. And what's even most exciting about it, as you layer it within these cohort type of groups, you move away from the scariness of the issues around consent, and you move into a space to where you're doing this the right way. You're getting consumer-based consent at the end of the day. You're working with the publishers in a meaningful way, and the brands are now starting to see the benefit from that, and it rises all tides.